date was April 9, 1483. In Westminster Palace, King Edward IV lay dying at just 40 years old, his once powerful frame ravaged by what chroniclers called a brief illness. But as the king drew his final breaths, a far more sinister sickness was already spreading through the corridors of power, the deadly disease of ambition that would soon consume two innocent boys. Edward's deathbed was surrounded by the great nobles of England, their faces masks of solemn respect hiding the calculations already spinning behind their eyes. The dying king's thoughts, however, were consumed by a single, terrifying worry. His heir, 12-year-old Prince Edward, was hundreds of miles away in Wales, protected only by his maternal relatives, the Woodvilles, a family that had accumulated powerful enemies during Edward IV's 22-year reign. "Protect my sons," the king whispered to his assembled lords, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the chamber's fire. Those three words would prove to be either a desperate father's final plea or a cruel twist of irony that history would debate for centuries. The moment Edward IV's eyes closed forever, England plunged into the most dangerous period any kingdom can face, the uncertain succession of a child king. Young Edward V was not just inheriting a throne. He was inheriting a web of court intrigue, family rivalries, and political ambitions that had been festering throughout his father's reign. In the shadows of that death chamber stood Richard of Gloucester, the dead king's youngest brother. At 30 years old, Richard was everything the boy king was not: a battle-tested warrior, a proven administrator, and a man who commanded the absolute loyalty of the powerful northern lords. The chroniclers described him as small in stature but fierce in demeanor, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see through the courtly facades that surrounded him. While others whispered prayers for the dead king, Richard's mind was already racing ahead to the challenges facing the realm. The Woodville family, led by the boy king's mother, Elizabeth, and her brother Anthony Woodville, had controlled access to young Edward throughout his childhood. They had shaped his education, influenced his friendships, and most importantly, they would now control his reign. For a man like Richard, who had spent his adult life serving his brother's crown with unwavering loyalty, the thought of England being ruled by a child under the influence of the ambitious Woodville faction was unthinkable. But there was another consideration that would prove even more crucial: the legitimacy question that had haunted the royal family for decades. Edward IV himself had seized the throne through conquest, overthrowing the Lancastrian king Henry VI in a brutal civil war. The Tudor claim to legitimacy was thin at best, built on marriage alliances and military victories rather than unquestionable bloodline succession. In such an environment, any weakness, any doubt about a ruler's right to the crown, could ignite another devastating war. As news of the king's death spread beyond the palace walls, riders were already galloping through the English countryside carrying messages that would set in motion one of the most controversial episodes in royal history. In Wales, young Edward V was preparing for a journey that would change his life forever, a journey to London to claim his inheritance. In the northern strongholds, Richard's supporters were being quietly alerted that their lord might soon need their swords. And in the shadowy alcoves of Westminster, other players in this deadly game were making their own preparations. The Woodvilles knew that Richard represented the greatest threat to their continued power and influence. The established nobility, many of whom had chafed under Woodville dominance, saw an opportunity to reclaim their traditional roles in governing the realm. What none of them could foresee was that this struggle for control would ultimately center on two young boys whose only crimes were being born into royalty. The stage was set for one of history's most enduring mysteries, a tale of power, betrayal, and two princes who would walk into the Tower of London and vanish from the pages of history forever. The crown's shadow was falling across England, and in that darkness, the fate of the princes in the tower was already being written. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Welsh countryside as 12-year-old Edward V prepared to leave Ludlow Castle for what would be the most important journey of his young life. The date was April 24, 1483, just 2 weeks after his father's death, and the boy who was now King of England had no idea that he was riding toward his doom. Edward was everything a medieval king should be: tall for his age, with the golden hair of the Plantagenet bloodline, and an intelligence that impressed even the hardened nobles who served as his tutors. Chronicles describe him as gracious and well-spoken, with a maturity beyond his years that had been carefully cultivated by his mother's family. But maturity, no matter how impressive, was no protection against the deadly currents of adult ambition that were now swirling around him. The boy's escort was magnificent, a procession that stretched for miles along the muddy roads leading from Wales toward London. At its head rode Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, the young king's uncle and the man who had been his primary guardian and educator since childhood. Rivers was a Renaissance prince in the truest sense, a scholar, a warrior, and a politician who had spent years preparing his nephew for kingship. Behind him rode Sir Richard Grey, the king's half-brother, and a carefully selected group of nobles and knights whose loyalty to the Woodville cause was absolute. But the most striking figure in the procession was young Edward himself, mounted on a white palfrey and wearing the colors of his royal house. The chroniclers noted that he carried himself with remarkable dignity for one so young, acknowledging the cheers of the common people who gathered along the roadside to catch a glimpse of their new monarch. To these simple folk, he was their rightful king, the son of Edward IV who had brought them peace and prosperity. They had no way of knowing that powerful men were already plotting to ensure this boy would never truly rule. As the royal procession made its way through the English countryside, a parallel drama was unfolding in the northern reaches of the kingdom. Richard of Gloucester had wasted no time after his brother's death. Within days, he had dispatched urgent messages to his most trusted allies, calling them to arms under the pretense of ensuring young Edward's safe passage to London. But those who knew Richard best understood the deeper currents beneath these seemingly protective actions. The Duke of Buckingham, Henry Stafford, was among the first to answer Richard's call. Buckingham was a man consumed by his own ambitions, a descendant of Edward III, who had his own distant claim to the throne and his own reasons for opposing Woodville dominance. When he met with Richard at Northampton, the two men spoke in private for hours, their conversation covering topics that no scribe was allowed to record. Whatever was discussed in that chamber would soon reshape the destiny of England. Meanwhile, young Edward remained blissfully unaware of the deadly game being played around him. His tutors had taught him about the responsibilities of kingship, about justice and mercy and the divine right of kings. But no one had prepared him for the reality that his own family might become his greatest threat. In the evenings, as the royal procession made camp, Edward would sit with his advisors, discussing the plans for his coronation and the great ceremonies that would mark the beginning of his reign. The irony was heartbreaking. Here was a boy genuinely excited about becoming king, earnestly discussing the reforms he hoped to implement and the ways he might serve his people. Anthony Woodville, watching his nephew's enthusiasm, must have felt the weight of the approaching crisis. Intelligence was already reaching the Woodville camp about Richard's movements, about the men he was gathering, about the dangerous undercurrents flowing beneath his protestations of loyalty. On April 29th, the royal procession reached Stony Stratford, just 50 miles from London and safety. It was here that Anthony Woodville made a decision that historians would debate for centuries. He agreed to meet with Richard of Gloucester at nearby Northampton. Perhaps he believed that negotiation was still possible, that the interests of the realm could be balanced against the ambitions of individual men. Perhaps he hoped that by showing trust in Richard, he could defuse the growing tension. Or perhaps he simply had no choice. Richard's forces were growing by the day, and the Woodville faction was far from their power base in the Welsh marches. The boy king's safety depended on reaching London and the security of established royal authority. But as the sun set on April 29th, with young Edward bedded down for what he believed was just another night of his coronation journey, the trap was already closing around him. In Northampton, Richard of Gloucester was hosting a dinner that would be remembered as one of the most consequential meals in English history. The guests included Anthony Woodville and Richard Grey, men who still believed they were dining with an ally. They had no way of knowing that before dawn, their world would be turned upside down, and the boy they had sworn to protect would be walking into the most famous prison in England. The crown jewels were waiting in London. The coronation preparations were nearly complete, but the boy king's journey would end not in Westminster Abbey, but behind the ancient walls of the Tower of London, in rooms from which he would never emerge. Dawn broke over Northampton on April 30th, 1483, with a deception so masterful it would echo through 5 centuries of history. In the inn where Anthony Woodville and Richard Grey had spent what they believed was a cordial evening with Richard of Gloucester, armed men were already moving through the corridors with practiced silence. The trap that had been months in the making was about to spring shut. Richard had played his role to perfection the night before. Chronicles describe him as charming and gracious, speaking fondly of his late brother Edward IV and expressing nothing but devotion to the boy king's cause. He had raised his cup in toast after toast to young Edward's health, to the prosperity of the realm, and to the bonds of family that supposedly united them all in service to the crown. But beneath the surface courtesy, Richard's mind was calculating every move in a deadly game where the stakes were nothing less than the throne of England. The Woodville men never saw it coming. As they prepared to break their fast and rejoin the royal procession, soldiers wearing Richard's white boar badge burst through their chamber doors. Anthony Woodville, the scholar knight who had spent years preparing his nephew for kingship, found himself staring down sword points held by men he had trusted. Richard Grey, barely more than a youth himself, was seized before he could even cry out a warning. "You stand accused of corrupting the king's grace and threatening the stability of the realm," Richard announced as he entered the chamber, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man who had spent his life commanding in battle. The charges were as vague as they were damning, exactly the kind of accusations that could justify any action while providing legal cover for what was essentially a coup. But the true genius of Richard's plan lay not in the arrests themselves, but in what happened next. While Woodville and Grey were being shackled like common criminals, Richard was already riding hard towards Stony Stratford, where young Edward V waited in blissful ignorance of the catastrophe that had just befallen his closest protectors. The boy king was taking his morning meal when Richard burst into his presence, still wearing the mud-stained clothes of hard travel and accompanied by a growing retinue of armed men. The contrast was deliberate and devastating. Here was the experienced uncle, sacrificing his own comfort to protect his nephew, arriving just in time to save the realm from unnamed but terrible dangers. "Your Grace," Richard said, dropping to one knee with perfect theatrical timing, "I bring grave news. Your mother's family has sought to corrupt your royal person and exclude your father's true blood from the governance of this realm. I have acted only to preserve your sacred majesty and ensure your safe passage to London." The 12-year-old Edward, trained from childhood in the elaborate courtesies of medieval kingship, had no framework for understanding what was really happening. His tutors had taught him that family loyalty was sacred, that blood bonds were unbreakable, that his father's brothers would always be his most trusted advisors. The idea that his beloved Uncle Richard might be lying to him, might be orchestrating his destruction even as he knelt in apparent submission, was simply beyond his comprehension. "Where is my Uncle Rivers?" Edward asked, his young voice carrying a tremor of confusion. "Where is Richard Grey? They were to escort me to London for my coronation." Richard's answer was a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as painful duty. "They are safely detained, Your Grace, for questioning about their treasonous plans. I take no pleasure in these actions, but the crown must be protected from those who would use your youth and innocence for their own advancement. I am your father's brother, your protector by blood and by right. Trust in me, and all will be well." What choice did a 12-year-old boy have? Surrounded by armed men wearing his uncle's colors, cut off from his trusted advisors, and faced with accusations he couldn't understand against people he loved, Edward could only nod his consent to whatever Richard proposed. In that moment, the boy king effectively signed away his freedom, though he had no way of knowing it. The journey to London that resumed that morning was utterly different from the triumphant procession that had left Wales. Gone were the Woodville banners and the celebration of a new reign beginning. In their place rode Richard's men, grim-faced northerners whose loyalty belonged not to the crown, but to the man who now controlled it. Young Edward, still dressed in his royal finery, had become a prisoner masquerading as a king. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Richard's gambit was how easily it was accepted. When word reached London of the arrests and the change in Edward's escort, the political establishment barely blinked. The Woodvilles had made too many enemies during their years of power, and Richard's reputation as a loyal brother and competent administrator provided perfect cover for his actions. Even Elizabeth Woodville, the boy's mother and England's queen, found herself powerless to respond effectively to the catastrophe unfolding around her son. As the procession approached London, Richard was already planning his next moves. The Tower of London, that ancient fortress on the Thames, would provide the perfect accommodation for a young king who needed protection during these troubled times. The coronation, of course, would need to be delayed while these serious accusations against the Woodville faction were investigated. And during that delay, other questions might arise. Questions about the validity of Edward IV's marriage, about the legitimacy of his children, about whether England really needed a boy king at all when a proven warrior and administrator was available to serve. The boy riding beside Richard that May morning still believed he was traveling to claim his throne. In reality, he was riding toward the most famous unsolved mystery in English history. The uncle's gambit had succeeded beyond Richard's wildest dreams, but the true cost of that success was only beginning to unfold. The Tower of London rose from the Thames like a stone giant, its ancient walls casting long shadows across the murky waters as young Edward V approached what he believed would be his temporary palace. It was May 4th, 1483, and the 12-year-old king had no way of knowing that he was about to enter the most notorious fortress in England, a place where royalty came to prepare for coronations, but also where they came to die. Richard of Gloucester had chosen the tower with calculated precision. To the outside world, it was the logical choice. The fortress served as both royal residence and secure stronghold, the perfect place to house a young king during turbulent times. The tower had been home to monarchs for centuries. Edward's own father had stayed there before his coronation. But Richard understood the tower's dual nature better than most. Behind its imposing walls, people could vanish as completely as if they had never existed. The royal barge carrying Edward V glided through the tower's water gate, beneath the stone archway that would later be known as Traitor's Gate. The irony was lost on the young king, who gazed up at the massive white tower with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Chronicles describe him as unnaturally quiet during the river journey, perhaps sensing that something fundamental had changed in his world since his uncle's dramatic intervention at Stony Stratford. Sir Robert Brackenbury, the tower's constable, greeted the royal party with all the ceremony due to a reigning monarch. But those watching closely might have noticed that his deference was directed more toward Richard than toward the boy who wore the crown. Brackenbury was Richard's man through and through, a Yorkshire knight who had served faithfully in the northern campaigns and whose loyalty was absolute. If difficult tasks needed to be accomplished within the tower's walls, he was exactly the kind of man who would ask no questions and leave no witnesses. Edward's apartments were magnificent, befitting his royal status. The rooms in the Garden Tower, later to be renamed the Bloody Tower, were decorated with rich tapestries and furnished with every comfort a young king might require. There were books for his studies, space for exercise, and windows that looked out over the Thames and the bustling life of London beyond. But there were also guards at every door, ostensibly for his protection but positioned in a way that made departure impossible without permission. The boy king's isolation was carefully orchestrated. His servants were Richard's choices, men whose first loyalty lay with the Lord Protector rather than the crown. His meals were prepared in the tower's kitchens and served by hands that answered to Brackenbury. Even his entertainment was controlled. No visitors were allowed without Richard's explicit permission, and those who were granted access found their conversations monitored by ever-present guards. Within days of Edward's arrival, Richard made his next crucial move. A message was dispatched to Westminster, where Queen Elizabeth Woodville had taken sanctuary in the Abbey along with her younger children. The message was courteous but firm. Young Prince Richard of York, Edward's 9-year-old brother, was needed in the tower to provide companionship for his lonely older brother and to participate in the coronation preparations. Elizabeth Woodville's response revealed the depth of her desperation. The former queen, one of the most politically astute women of her generation, fought the request with every weapon at her disposal. She argued that her younger son was too ill to travel, that he needed to remain with his mother, that the coronation could proceed without his presence. But she was fighting from a position of complete powerlessness. Richard controlled the government, commanded the armies, and held her eldest son prisoner in all but name. The negotiations stretched for days, with Richard's representatives making increasingly pointed arguments about the importance of family unity during these crucial times. Finally, the church authorities themselves intervened, arguing that sanctuary was meant to protect the innocent from immediate danger, not to obstruct the legitimate requirements of royal ceremony. On June 16, 1483, 9-year-old Richard of York left the protection of Westminster Abbey and joined his brother behind the tower's walls. The reunion between the brothers was both heartbreaking and ominous. Witnesses described young Richard as confused and frightened, clinging to his older brother and asking repeatedly when they would be allowed to return to their mother. Edward, trying to project the confidence expected of a king, assured his little brother that their stay in the tower was temporary, that their coronation was still being planned, that everything would soon return to normal. But even a 12-year-old could read the signs that all was not well. The coronation, originally scheduled for May 4th, had been postponed indefinitely. The great nobles who should have been flocking to London to pay homage to their new king were mysteriously absent. Most telling of all, their uncle Richard seemed to be conducting the business of government as if he, rather than Edward, were the true ruler of England. The boys established routines within their gilded cage. They took their meals together, studied their lessons, and played games in the tower's gardens under the watchful eyes of their guards. Servants reported seeing them shooting arrows at targets in the inner ward, racing each other around the green, and engaging in the kind of boisterous play that was natural for children their age. To casual observers, they seemed like any other royal princes enjoying a stay at one of their father's residences. But as May turned to June, and June stretched toward July, the boys' situation grew increasingly precarious. Richard of Gloucester was consolidating his power with methodical efficiency, removing potential rivals and installing his own supporters in key positions throughout the government. The coronation of Edward V, supposedly the reason for all these elaborate preparations, receded further and further into an uncertain future. The tower's walls, built to keep enemies out, were now serving their opposite purpose, keeping two young princes in. And as summer deepened over London, whispers began to spread through the city's streets. People were asking uncomfortable questions about the boys' prolonged stay in the fortress, about their absence from public view, about what exactly the Lord Protector was planning for England's future. Inside the tower, the two brothers played their games and said their prayers, unaware that they were living through the final act of a drama that would make their names immortal in the annals of mystery and murder. June 22, 1483. The date would be seared into English history as the day legitimacy itself was weaponized. Dr. Ralph Shaw, one of London's most respected clergymen, climbed the steps to the pulpit at St. Paul's Cross, the city's most important venue for public proclamations. The crowd that gathered below him had come expecting routine religious instruction. Instead, they were about to witness one of the most audacious character assassinations ever attempted against the English royal family. Richard of Gloucester had orchestrated this moment with the precision of a master strategist. For weeks, whispers had been circulating through London's taverns and marketplaces, carefully planted rumors about irregularities in the late King Edward IV marriage, about secret ceremonies and hidden scandals that cast doubt on the legitimacy of his children. Now, those whispers were about to become official doctrine, proclaimed from the most sacred platform in the realm. Dr. Shaw's sermon began conventionally enough, with biblical quotations about the importance of legitimate authority and divine right. But as he warmed to his theme, his words took on a devastating precision that left no doubt about their true target. "Bastard slips shall not take deep root," he declared, his voice carrying across the stunned crowd. The biblical text he had chosen for his sermon was no accident. It was a direct assault on the legitimacy of the two boys imprisoned in the Tower of London. The accusations that poured from Shaw's mouth were as shocking as they were specific. Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, the clergyman declared, had been invalid from the very beginning. The late king had already been contracted to marry Lady Eleanor Butler when he secretly wed Elizabeth in 1464. Under church law, this prior contract, even if unconsummated, made the subsequent marriage bigamous and illegitimate. The children of that union, including the boy currently claiming to be Edward V, were bastards with no right to the English throne. The crowd's reaction was mixed, some gasping in shock, others muttering in confusion, and a few calling out questions that Dr. Shah pretended not to hear. The timing of these revelations was impossibly convenient for Richard of Gloucester, appearing just as his grip on power was tightening and the princes in the Tower were becoming increasingly inconvenient reminders of the true line of succession. But the brilliance of Richard's plan lay not just in the accusations themselves, but in their source. Dr. Shah was no political hack or ambitious courtier who could be dismissed as a self-serving liar. He was a respected theologian, a man whose moral authority was unquestioned, someone whose word carried weight with both the common people and the nobility. When such a man spoke from the pulpit of St. Paul's Cross, his words carried the force of divine revelation. Within hours of Shah's sermon, the story was spreading throughout London like wildfire. In the Tower, where the two young princes continued their daily routines unaware of the catastrophe unfolding around them, servants whispered about the shocking news from the city. The boys who had gone to bed as the rightful heirs to England's throne had awakened to find themselves declared bastards, their royal blood suddenly transformed into illegitimate accident. The legal machinery that would formalize this declaration was already in motion. Richard's supporters in Parliament were preparing legislation that would codify the bastard declaration and legally exclude Edward IV's children from the succession. The document, which would later be known as Titulus Regius, read like a legal indictment of the dead king's entire family, stripping his children not just of their royal status, but of their very identity as legitimate members of the Plantagenet dynasty. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the bastard declaration was what it revealed about Richard's long-term planning. The evidence against Edward IV's marriage, if it existed at all, had been known for nearly 20 years. Lady Eleanor Butler had died in 1468, taking any direct testimony about her alleged contract with Edward to her grave. The bishop who supposedly performed the ceremony was also long dead. The timing of these revelations, emerging just when Richard needed them most, suggested either remarkable coincidence or careful conspiracy. Young Edward V, confined in the Tower with his brother, must have struggled to understand the implications of what was happening. His tutors had taught him that kingship was a sacred trust, that royal blood was a divine gift that could never be taken away. The idea that legitimacy itself could be redefined by political necessity, that his father's marriage could be retroactively declared invalid, challenged everything he had been taught about the nature of monarchy and his own identity. Richard of York, only 9 years old, was even less equipped to comprehend the legal and theological arguments that were destroying his family's claims. To him, the declaration must have seemed like an incomprehensible nightmare. One day he was a prince of England. The next he was being told he was nothing more than a bastard child with no rights and no future. The bastard declaration achieved exactly what Richard intended. It provided legal justification for removing the inconvenient princes from the line of succession while positioning himself as the only legitimate heir to his brother's throne. Under English law, if Edward IV's children were illegitimate, then Richard, as Edward's surviving brother, became the rightful king. The speed with which the political establishment accepted these revelations was perhaps the most damning evidence of their manufactured nature. Within days, the great nobles of England were lining up to acknowledge Richard as their rightful sovereign, apparently convinced by evidence that had remained hidden for 2 decades but conveniently surfaced exactly when needed. For the two boys in the Tower, the bastard declaration marked the end of their royal status and the beginning of their transformation from inconvenient heirs into dangerous liabilities. They were no longer future kings requiring protection. They were living reminders of a claim to legitimacy that Richard could never allow to be reasserted. The walls of the Tower, once their temporary palace, had become their permanent prison, and somewhere in the shadows, darker plans were already taking shape for two boys whose only remaining value lay in their silence. July 1483 descended upon London like a shroud, bringing with it an oppressive heat that seemed to mirror the suffocating political atmosphere engulfing the realm. In the Tower of London, two young boys who had once been princes of England were about to vanish from the stage of history, their disappearance orchestrated with such precision that 5 centuries later, the world would still be searching for answers. The coronation of Richard III on July 6 was a spectacle of calculated magnificence, designed to project legitimacy and divine approval for the new king's reign. Westminster Abbey filled with nobles who had abandoned their former oaths to Edward V with remarkable speed, their faces masks of solemn duty as they witnessed Richard's transformation from Lord Protector to anointed monarch. But even as the crown was placed upon his head, the two boys in the Tower remained the most dangerous threat to his newfound authority. Sir Robert Brackenbury, the Tower's constable, had been receiving increasingly specific instructions from the new king. The prince's household was gradually reduced, their servants replaced with men whose loyalty to Richard was absolute. Their tutors were dismissed under various pretexts, their contact with the outside world systematically severed. What had once been a royal residence was methodically transformed into a high-security prison, though the boys themselves might not have immediately recognized the change. The last reliable sighting of Edward and Richard of York came in early July, when they were observed playing in the Tower's inner courtyard. A contemporary chronicler, writing years later, described them as appearing in good health, but noticeably subdued, their earlier energy replaced by a kind of watchful apprehension that seemed unnatural in children so young. They were seen shooting arrows at targets under the supervision of their guards, their childish laughter echoing off the ancient stones in what would be remembered as an eerily prophetic farewell to life. Dr. Argentine, the boys' physician, would later provide the most haunting testimony about their final days. He described young Edward V as increasingly withdrawn and melancholy, spending hours in prayer and speaking repeatedly about his certainty that he and his brother were going to die. "I do not want to die," the former king allegedly told his doctor, "but I fear we are condemned men." These words, reported years after the fact, carry the terrible weight of a child's premonition proving tragically accurate. The physician also noted disturbing changes in the boys' routine. Their meals became irregular, their sleep patterns disrupted. They were moved from their original apartments to smaller chambers deeper within the Tower's complex, ostensibly for their greater security, but effectively cutting them off from even the minimal observation they had previously received from servants and guards. Dr. Argentine himself found his access to his young patients increasingly restricted, until finally he was barred from seeing them altogether. By the middle of July, an ominous quiet had settled over the Tower. The boys who had once been visible in the gardens and courtyards simply vanished from sight. When concerned citizens asked about the prince's welfare, they were told that the former king and his brother were in good health, but required complete privacy during this difficult transition period. The explanation satisfied few, but in Richard III England, asking too many questions about royal arrangements could prove dangerously unhealthy. The summer air itself seemed to conspire in the developing mystery. London was sweltering under an unusual heat wave that kept windows shuttered and curtains drawn throughout the city. In the Tower, the thick stone walls that had protected English kings for centuries now served to muffle any sounds that might have emerged from the prince's quarters. If cries for help were raised within those chambers, if struggles occurred in the darkness of July nights, the ancient stones absorbed every echo. Margaret Beaufort, the mother of the future Henry Tudor and one of the most astute political observers of her generation, would later write that a great silence fell upon the Tower that summer, as if death itself had taken residence within its walls. Her words, written in private correspondence years after the events, suggest that even those not directly involved in the conspiracy could sense that something monstrous was unfolding behind the fortress's imposing facade. The few servants who remained in contact with the prince's quarters began reporting strange occurrences. Guards who had been jovial and talkative became grim and silent. Night watches were doubled, then tripled, with explicit orders that no one was to enter the prince's chambers without direct authorization from Brackenbury himself. Most telling of all, the boys' laundry ceased to appear in the Tower's washing areas, and their meals began returning to the kitchens untouched. London's citizens, already unsettled by the rapid political changes that had transformed their 12-year-old king into a bastard and elevated his uncle to the throne, began to notice the absence of the young princes from public view. Rumors started as whispers in marketplaces and taverns, but gradually grew into a chorus of concern that even Richard's most loyal supporters could not entirely suppress. Where were the boys? Why had they not been seen for weeks? What was happening behind the tower's forbidding walls? The answers to these questions were known to fewer than a handful of men, and those men were bound by oaths of secrecy that they would carry to their graves. But the evidence of the prince's fate was already being carefully concealed within the tower itself, buried in places where it might lie hidden for centuries to come. As July faded into August, the summer of silence was drawing to its close. The two boys who had entered the tower as princes of England would never emerge alive. Their disappearance, accomplished with such thoroughness that no contemporary witness could testify to their exact fate, would become one of history's most enduring mysteries. But for Richard III, the silence was golden. It meant that the last obstacles to his unchallenged rule had been permanently removed. The summer heat would eventually break, but the chill that settled over the Tower of London that July would never lift. In the darkness of those sweltering nights, a crime was committed that would haunt the English monarchy for centuries, leaving behind only questions, whispers, and the terrible certainty that two innocent children had paid the ultimate price for their uncle's ambition. August 1483 marked the complete transformation of Richard of Gloucester from loyal brother to undisputed monarch, but it was a crown purchased with the blood of innocence and worn over the protests of a kingdom's conscience. As the summer heat finally began to break over London, the new king Richard III moved with ruthless efficiency to consolidate his power, knowing that every day of his reign depended upon the permanent silence of two boys who had once been the rightful heirs to England's throne. The official machinery of government hummed with manufactured legitimacy. Parliament formally ratified the Titulus Regius, the document that declared Edward IV children bastards and confirmed Richard's right to rule. The Great Seal was redesigned to bear Richard's image instead of young Edward's. Royal proclamations went forth across the realm announcing the new king's accession and demanding the loyalty of all subjects. But beneath this veneer of legal propriety, a more sinister reality was taking shape. Sir James Tyrrell arrived at the Tower of London on a night in late August, carrying written orders that would never be preserved in any official record. Tyrrell was Richard's creature through and through, a Yorkshire knight whose devotion to his master was absolute, and whose conscience had been long since corrupted by years of dirty work performed in the shadows of power. Chronicles would later describe him as a man of great heart but small scruple, exactly the kind of servant who could be trusted with the most terrible of tasks. The meeting between Tyrrell and Sir Robert Brackenbury in the Tower's constable chamber was brief and conducted in whispers that the stone walls absorbed without echo. Brackenbury, despite his loyalty to Richard, had grown increasingly uncomfortable with his role as jailer to the princes. The sight of two young boys gradually fading away in their prison chambers had apparently awakened whatever remained of his conscience. But Tyrrell brought orders that brooked no discussion and offered no alternatives. What happened next would be reconstructed years later from the confessions of dying men, but the essential details remained horrifyingly consistent across all accounts. In the dark hours before dawn, while London slept in ignorance of the crime being committed in its heart, Tyrrell made his way to the prince's chambers accompanied by two accomplices whose names would become synonymous with child murder, Miles Forrest and John Dighton. Edward V, the boy who had been king of England for 3 months, was reportedly sleeping peacefully when the assassins entered his chamber. His brother Richard lay beside him, the two children having been moved to share quarters during their final weeks of captivity. Contemporary accounts suggest that the princes awakened as their killers approached, that they recognized their danger and cried out for mercy that would never come. The method of their deaths was chosen for its efficiency and its silence. No sword wounds that might bleed through mattresses, no screaming that might alert guards who were not part of the conspiracy. Instead, the children were smothered, their young lives snuffed out with a brutality that was made even more horrific by its calculated restraint. Pillows pressed over their faces until their struggles ceased, until the last breath left their small bodies, until England's rightful king and his innocent brother became nothing more than obstacles permanently removed. The disposal of the bodies revealed the meticulous planning that had gone into the crime. Under Tyrrell's supervision, the princes were buried at the foot of a staircase within the tower's walls, their graves dug deep enough to hide the evidence of Richard's ultimate solution to the succession problem. Lime was poured over the bodies to hasten their decomposition, and the earth was carefully replaced and disguised to show no evidence of disturbance. But the cover-up extended far beyond the mere concealment of corpses. The servants who had attended the princes in their final days were quietly transferred to distant postings or eliminated entirely. The guards who had witnessed the gradual tightening of security around the boys' quarters found themselves reassigned to remote castles where their observations could pose no threat to the official narrative. Even the tower's cats and dogs were removed, lest their behavior around the burial site attract unwanted attention. Within days of the murders, Richard III court was buzzing with carefully orchestrated rumors about the prince's fate. Some whispered that they had been spirited away to safety in foreign courts, hidden until the political situation stabilized. Others suggested that they had died of natural causes. Childhood diseases were common enough that such explanations seemed plausible. The most audacious rumors claimed that the boys had never been in the tower at all, that they were living quietly in obscurity under assumed names. Richard himself maintained a studied silence on the subject, neither confirming nor denying the various stories circulating about his nephews. When pressed by foreign ambassadors or nervous nobles about the prince's welfare, he would speak vaguely of their need for privacy and protection, never quite admitting that they were dead, but never producing evidence that they were alive. This calculated ambiguity served his purposes perfectly. It eliminated the princes as threats while avoiding the political backlash that might have followed their known execution. The transformation of England under Richard III rule was swift and comprehensive. Laws were passed, taxes collected, foreign policies implemented, all the ordinary business of monarchy proceeding as if the crown had passed through entirely legitimate channels. Richard proved himself a competent administrator and an able military commander, winning the grudging respect of many who had initially opposed his usurpation. But competence could not erase the stain of child murder, and legitimacy could not be manufactured through legal documents alone. Throughout England, in manor houses and merchant halls, in monastery cells and peasant cottages, people asked the same questions. Where were the princes? What had become of Edward IV's sons? Why had they vanished so completely from public view? The answers lay buried beneath the tower's stones, but the questions would outlive everyone who knew the truth. Richard III had won his crown through the most thorough elimination of rivals in English history, but he had also planted the seeds of his own downfall. A king who could murder children to secure his throne was a king who could never truly be trusted, and the knowledge of what he had done would eventually provide his enemies with the moral authority they needed to destroy him. The crown was usurped, the princes were dead, and England was ruled by a man who had proven there were no limits to his ambition. But somewhere in the darkness of the tower, in graves that would remain hidden for centuries, the victims of Richard's ultimate crime waited for history to uncover their story and demand justice for the innocents whose only sin was being born too close to the throne. September 1483 brought with it the first autumn chill and something far more sinister, the slow, inexorable spread of rumors that would ultimately prove more dangerous to Richard III's reign than any army ever fielded against him. In the taverns of London, the manor houses of the nobility, and the foreign courts of Europe, a single question echoed with increasing urgency. What had become of the princes in the tower? The absence of Edward V and Richard of York from public view had initially been explained by the chaos of political transition and the need to protect the boys during uncertain times. But as weeks turned to months, and the new king continued to offer only vague assurances about his nephew's welfare, even Richard's most loyal supporters began to harbor uncomfortable suspicions. The silence from the tower had become so complete, so absolute, that it could only mean one thing. The princes were dead. Dominic Mancini, an Italian cleric visiting London during those crucial months, would later write the most damning contemporary account of the growing certainty surrounding the prince's fate. Already there was a suspicion that they had been done away with, he recorded. Whether, however, they have been done away with and by what manner of death, so far I have not at all discovered. His words, written with the careful precision of a man who understood the deadly implications of what he was documenting, captured the atmosphere of fearful certainty that was settling over England. The first cracks in the official silence appeared when Dr. Argentine, the prince's former physician, began speaking privately about his final encounters with young Edward V. The doctor's account, whispered in the confidential chambers of other medical practitioners, painted a terrifying picture of a child who had sensed his approaching doom. The young king, like a victim prepared for sacrifice, sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance, Argentine reported, because he believed that death was facing him. These medical testimonies carried particular weight because physicians were bound by codes of discretion that made their private revelations all the more significant. When a doctor violated the sacred trust between healer and patient to speak of such matters, it suggested a moral imperative that transcended professional obligations. Argentine's words spread through London's educated classes like poison in a well, contaminating Richard's carefully constructed narrative of legitimate succession. More damaging still were the reports emerging from within the tower itself. Despite Richard's efforts to eliminate potentially compromising witnesses, rumors began circulating about guards who had been dismissed after expressing discomfort with their duties, about servants who had disappeared mysteriously after asking too many questions about the prince's welfare. Robert Brackenbury, the tower's constable, was observed to be increasingly withdrawn and troubled, his former confidence replaced by the haunted demeanor of a man carrying unbearable secrets. The most persistent and specific rumors centered on Sir James Tyrrell, whose sudden elevation in Richard's court coincided suspiciously with the prince's disappearance. Courtiers whispered about Tyrrell's late-night visit to the tower, about his private meetings with the king, about the generous grants of land and title he had received immediately following his mysterious mission. When men asked too directly about these coincidences, they found themselves facing the kind of royal displeasure that could prove fatal. Foreign ambassadors reporting back to their sovereigns provided perhaps the most objective assessment of the situation unfolding in England. Philippe de Comines, the French diplomat and chronicler, wrote that the two children of King Edward were reputed to be dead, and no one knew how. His matter-of-fact reporting reflected the international consensus that Richard's nephews had been eliminated, even if the specific details of their deaths remained shrouded in mystery. The political implications of these whispers were profound and immediate. Henry Tudor, the Lancastrian claimant who had been living in exile, found his cause suddenly energized by the growing belief that Richard was a child killer. Where Tudor had previously struggled to gain support for his tenuous claim to the English throne, he now found potential allies rallying to him not out of love for Lancaster, but out of revulsion for a king who could murder children to secure his crown. Elizabeth of York, the prince's older sister, became an unwitting symbol of the tragedy that had befallen Edward IV's children. Her potential marriage to Henry Tudor offered the possibility of uniting the warring royal houses, but it also served as a constant reminder of her brother's fate. Every public appearance by Elizabeth raised the unspoken question: if she survived, what had happened to the boys who should have been ahead of her in the succession? The whispers took on increasingly specific detail as the autumn progressed. Stories circulated about smothered children, about bodies buried in secret, about the terrible sounds that had allegedly emerged from the tower on certain dark nights. While these accounts varied in their specifics, they shared a common core of certainty. The princes were dead, and Richard III was responsible for their deaths. Perhaps most damning of all was Richard's own behavior in the face of these escalating rumors. A king innocent of child murder would have had every incentive to produce the princes alive, to parade them before the public and silence the whispers that were poisoning his reign. Instead, Richard maintained his policy of calculated ambiguity, neither confirming the boys' deaths nor providing evidence of their survival. This silence was interpreted by contemporary observers as tantamount to confession. John Russell, the Bishop of Lincoln and former Chancellor, wrote that the king's failure to produce his nephews alive could only be understood as acknowledgement of their deaths. Such condemnation from church officials carried enormous weight in a deeply religious society, adding moral authority to the political opposition forming against Richard's rule. The psychological impact of these whispers on Richard himself became increasingly apparent as 1483 drew to a close. The confident, decisive ruler who had seized power with such efficiency was gradually being replaced by a paranoid, isolated figure who saw threats in every shadow. The crown he had won through the elimination of his rivals was becoming a burden too heavy to bear, poisoned by the knowledge of what he had done to obtain it. By winter, the whispers of murder had become a roar of condemnation that would echo through the centuries. The princes in the tower had achieved in death what they could never have accomplished in life. They had become the moral foundation for Richard III's ultimate destruction. Their silenced voices would speak from their hidden graves, calling for justice and vengeance that would come with sword and fire when Henry Tudor finally landed on English shores. July 17, 1674. Nearly 2 centuries had passed since the princes vanished into the tower's darkness, when workmen renovating the White Tower made a discovery that would reignite one of history's greatest mysteries. Christopher Wren, the renowned architect overseeing the tower's reconstruction, watched in growing amazement as his men uncovered a wooden chest buried beneath a staircase. A chest that contained the skeletal remains of 2 children. The discovery was as dramatic as it was unexpected. Workers demolishing an old staircase connecting the royal chapel to the White Tower found themselves staring into a makeshift grave that had been hidden for generations. Inside the crude wooden box lay 2 small skeletons, their bones intertwined as if the children had died in each other's arms. The larger skeleton appeared to be that of a child around 12 years of age, while the smaller remains suggested a victim closer to 9 or 10 years old. Ages that corresponded exactly to Edward V and Richard of York at the time of their disappearance. King Charles II, informed of the extraordinary find within hours of its discovery, made a decision that would echo through centuries of historical debate. Without ordering a thorough examination of the remains or attempting to determine their identity through available forensic methods, he declared the bones to be those of the murdered princes and commanded that they be interred with full royal honors in Westminster Abbey. The speed of this decision, and its finality, would later be seen as either appropriate reverence for royal victims or a tragic missed opportunity for historical truth. The examination that did take place was conducted by the royal physician, but it was cursory by even 17th century standards. The bones showed evidence of violence, not the clean breaks that might result from accident or natural death, but the kind of damage consistent with suffocation or strangulation. More tellingly, fabric fragments found with the remains included pieces of velvet and other expensive materials that would have been appropriate for royal children, but far beyond the means of common victims. John Knight, the tower's antiquarian, provided perhaps the most detailed contemporary account of the discovery. He noted that the remains were found at precisely the location where Tudor-era stories had placed the prince's burial site. The bones lay as if the children had been embraced in death, he wrote. The smaller form cradled against the larger in a manner that spoke of final comfort sought in terror. His description, while potentially embellished by romantic sensibility, captured the tragic intimacy suggested by the skeletal arrangement. The forensic evidence, primitive though it was by modern standards, painted a disturbing picture of the prince's final moments. Both skeletons showed signs of trauma consistent with violent death, but the specific nature of that trauma remained frustratingly unclear. The smaller skeleton displayed what appeared to be evidence of jaw displacement, possibly indicating that the child had been forcibly prevented from crying out. The larger skeleton showed stress fractures in the ribs that might have resulted from sustained pressure, precisely what would be expected if the victim had been smothered. Perhaps most significantly, the location of the burial precisely matched accounts that had circulated during Richard III's reign about where the prince's bodies had been concealed. Tudor chroniclers, writing decades after the alleged murders, had consistently placed the burial site at the foot of a staircase within the tower complex. That these stories, dismissed by many as politically motivated fiction, should prove accurate in such specific detail suggested that they might have been based on genuine knowledge rather than mere speculation. The wooden chest itself provided additional clues about the hasty nature of the burial. Roughly constructed from cheap timber and showing signs of having been hastily assembled, it was hardly the kind of coffin that would normally house royal remains. This suggested a secret burial conducted under extreme time pressure, exactly what would be expected if the princes had been murdered and their bodies required immediate concealment. But the discovery also raised troubling questions that would haunt historians for centuries to come. Why had the bodies been left in such a relatively shallow grave, where building renovations might eventually uncover them? If Richard III had ordered the murders, Why hadn't he ensured more permanent concealment of the evidence? And most puzzling of all, why did contemporary accounts suggest that the princes' bodies had been moved at least once after their initial burial? Sir Thomas More's account of the murders, written decades after the events, but based on interviews with surviving witnesses, had claimed that the princes were first buried at the foot of the staircase, but later moved to a more secure location on the orders of a priest who felt that such hasty burial was inappropriate for royal children. If More's account was accurate, then the bones discovered in 1674 might represent only the prince's temporary resting place, with their final burial site remaining unknown. The medieval evidence supporting the identification of the remains as the missing princes was compelling but not conclusive. Documents from Richard III's reign recorded unusual payments to Tower personnel around the time of the prince's disappearance, including substantial sums paid to men whose normal duties wouldn't have justified such rewards. These financial records, preserved in the Tower's archives, suggested that significant and sensitive work had been undertaken during the crucial summer of 1483. More circumstantial evidence came from the behavior of those who knew the truth. Sir James Tyrrell, the man long suspected of carrying out the murders, had been executed by Henry VII in 1502 for unrelated treason. But according to contemporary accounts, Tyrrell had confessed on the scaffold to killing the princes at Richard III's command, providing details about the burial that matched the 1674 discovery with disturbing accuracy. The bones found beneath the White Tower staircase were carefully examined by the royal physicians before being placed in a marble urn designed by Christopher Wren himself. The inscription on that urn, composed by the royal antiquarians, left no doubt about the official identification. Here lie the remains of Edward V, King of England, and Richard, Duke of York, foully murdered by their uncle Richard III. But even as the princes were finally laid to rest with the ceremony appropriate to their royal blood, questions lingered about the true story of their deaths. The bones in the staircase had provided tantalizing evidence of the crime that had haunted English history for 2 centuries. But they had also raised new mysteries that would challenge historians and forensic experts for generations to come. The discovery in the White Tower had transformed the princes in the tower from historical speculation into physical reality. 2 small skeletons that bore silent witness to one of the most infamous murders in English history. Yet, even in death, Edward V and Richard of York continued to guard their secrets, leaving the world to wonder whether justice had finally been served or whether the greatest mystery of the medieval age remained unsolved. 540 years after 2 young princes vanished behind the Tower of London's forbidding walls, the question that has consumed historians, forensic experts, and amateur detectives remains tantalizingly unresolved. Was Richard III a child killer? Or has history's greatest mystery been built upon a foundation of Tudor propaganda and circumstantial evidence? The case against Richard III appears overwhelming at first glance. He had motive. The princes represented the only significant threat to his claim to the throne. He had opportunity. The boys were in his custody, isolated from potential protectors, and dependent entirely on his mercy. He had means. As king, he commanded absolute loyalty from men capable of carrying out the most terrible of orders. The timing of the prince's disappearance, coinciding precisely with Richard's consolidation of power, seems too convenient to be mere coincidence. The circumstantial evidence is equally damning. The boys' complete disappearance from public view after July 1483, despite the political advantages Richard would have gained by producing them alive to counter rumors of their deaths. The suspicious elevation of Sir James Tyrrell immediately following the prince's vanishing. The systematic elimination of witnesses and the transfer of servants who might have possessed inconvenient knowledge. Most tellingly, Richard's own silence in the face of accusations that were destroying his reputation both domestically and internationally. Modern forensic analysis has added new dimensions to the historical evidence. In 1933, the bones discovered in 1674 were subjected to more rigorous scientific examination. The analysis confirmed that the remains were those of 2 children whose ages matched those of the princes at the time of their disappearance. Evidence of violence was present on both skeletons, and the burial showed signs of hasty concealment. Dental analysis suggested that the children had enjoyed the kind of high-quality nutrition available only to the wealthy elite, precisely what would be expected for royal princes. Yet, even as the evidence mounts against Richard III, alternative theories continue to find scholarly support. Some historians argue that the princes were killed not by their uncle, but by Henry Tudor after his victory at Bosworth Field in 1485. This theory suggests that the boys survived Richard's reign, but were eliminated by the new king to prevent future challenges to his rule. The complete absence of the princes from Henry's propaganda, despite the political advantages their survival would have provided, lends some credence to this darker possibility. Others point to the Duke of Buckingham, Richard's former ally who rebelled against him in 1483, as the true culprit. Buckingham had his own distant claim to the throne and might have eliminated the princes to clear his own path to power. His subsequent rebellion against Richard could have been motivated by guilt over his unauthorized actions or by Richard's discovery of his crimes. This theory would explain why Richard never produced the princes alive. He genuinely didn't know what had happened to them. The most intriguing alternative theory suggests that the princes survived their imprisonment and lived out their lives in obscurity under assumed identities. Proponents of this view point to the appearance of various pretenders in the years following Richard's death, including Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard of York and attracted significant international support for his cause. If one of the princes had indeed escaped, it would explain the persistence of challenges to Tudor rule throughout the late 15th and early 16th centuries. But perhaps the most significant development in recent decades has been the archaeological discovery of Richard III's own remains in a Leicester car park in 2012. The examination of Richard's skeleton revealed a man who had suffered from severe scoliosis, confirming Tudor accounts of his physical deformity, but also humanizing a figure who had been demonized by centuries of hostile propaganda. The discovery reminded historians that Richard was not the monstrous caricature portrayed by Shakespeare, but a complex individual operating within the brutal political realities of medieval England. DNA analysis of Richard's remains has opened new possibilities for resolving the prince's fate. If genetic material could be extracted from the bones in Westminster Abbey and compared with confirmed royal DNA, the question of their identity might finally be settled. However, the Church of England has been reluctant to permit such testing, arguing that the remains should not be disturbed for scientific purposes. This refusal has frustrated historians, while adding another layer of mystery to an already complex case. The psychological profile of Richard III presents a contradictory figure that defies easy categorization. Contemporary accounts describe him as a capable administrator, a brave warrior, and a man who showed genuine affection for his own children. He introduced progressive legal reforms and was praised by many of his subjects for his justice and fairness. Yet these same sources acknowledge his ruthless elimination of political rivals and his willingness to use extreme measures to secure his position. The broader context of 15th century politics suggests that child murder, while morally reprehensible, was not unprecedented among English royalty. The Wars of the Roses had already claimed numerous victims, including other royal children who posed threats to various claimants. Henry VI's son, Edward of Westminster, had been killed after the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471. The political necessity of eliminating rival claimants was well understood by medieval rulers, even when those rivals were children. Modern historians increasingly view the princes in the Tower case as emblematic of the challenges facing anyone attempting to understand the medieval past. The sources are limited, often biased, and frequently contradict each other. The physical evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. The political stakes were so high that truth became a casualty in the propaganda wars that followed. Yet despite 5 centuries of investigation, analysis, and debate, the mystery endures. The bones in Westminster Abbey continue to guard their secrets. The Tower of London maintains its grim silence about the events of that terrible summer in 1483. And somewhere in the shadows of history, the truth about what happened to Edward V and Richard of York remains hidden, perhaps forever. The verdict of history may never be final, but it has been decisive in one crucial respect. The fate of the princes in the Tower has become a touchstone for our understanding of power, innocence, and the terrible price that children sometimes pay for the ambitions of adults. Whether Richard III was guilty of their murders, or merely the victim of the most successful character assassination in English history, the story of two young boys who vanished behind tower walls continues to haunt our collective memory, reminding us that some mysteries are too profound, too tragic, and too human ever to be fully solved.